Hey guys, so yesterday when we were learning about the structures of a leaf, we talked about the vascular bundle and the xylem and phloem tubes and kind of what they transport and the direction that they transport materials in inside the plants. Today we're just going to be going more in depth into that kind of stuff. So this lesson is all about transport in plants. So we are going to be going into both how phloem and xylem tubes actually develop, briefly talking about the differences in their sap, and then also going in depth into all of the forces that allow their sap to move through the plant. So transport in plants occurs in the vascular tissue, which is again the vascular bundle, which is the phloem and xylem tubes surrounded by the sclerenchyma. These xylem tubes are the tubes that move water and minerals up from the roots to the leaves. So xylem tubes transport material upwards only. Xylem tubes start out like just normal rectangular plant cells that stack on top of each other end to end, but then the cells die and their cell walls thicken even further. The cell walls that are actually separating the cells, so when they touch where they're stacked on top of each other, those are called the end plates and they disappear. So we only maintain the cell walls on the outside of the xylem tube, not the ones that separate the cells in the middle. You also have pits or little holes that open up on the cell walls that are along the edge of the xylem tube, and water flows in through those tubes and actually pushes out all of the cytoplasm and replaces the cytoplasm that was inside of those cells. So you end up with a big, long, continuous xylem tube that goes from the root all the way up to the leaf, made of dead cells, and that is now filled with water. It doesn't have the cytoplasm, it doesn't have organelles anymore. It's just essentially turned into like a big, long straw. So this is what it would start off with just, again, your normal plant cells stacked on top of each other. Then once the xylem is mature, the inside has all been replaced with water because water flowed in through the pits that developed on the side and pushed out all of the cytoplasm. And as you can see, these end plates have also disappeared. So it's just a big, long, continuous straw with little pits on the sides to allow water in. At the start of each growing season, so that would be like spring for us, the old tubes are pushed deeper into the plant and new xylem tubes are made. And those old tubes just provide extra support for the growing plant. That's actually what we see as like the rings of a tree when you like cut a tree down. Each ring is actually just a layer of dead, no longer used xylem tubes. The xylem sap is just what we call the fluid that moves through the xylem tube. It is made of water and dissolved minerals. And again, it can only move up. So the Dixon-Jolly cohesion tension hypothesis is how we describe xylem transport. It essentially says that there are three different forces that allow xylem sap to move up a tree against the force of gravity. So those three forces are transpiration pull, capillary action, and root pressure. Transpiration pull is essentially this idea that as water evaporates from the top of the tree at the leaves, more water is going to get pulled in behind it to essentially like fill that vacuum that's been created. So essentially you're going to have a low concentration of water at the top of the tree, higher concentration where it's constantly being absorbed at the roots, and so the water will just move up the concentration gradient. It is kind of like sucking on a straw. As you pull water out of the straw into your mouth, you're going to create a vacuum that pulls up the remaining water behind it. That's essentially what's happening here. The water is leaving the straw of the xylem tube to go out into the atmosphere. That's creating kind of a vacuum that's going to pull more water up behind it. At the same time, you're also going to have ions pumped from the soil into the roots, so that you can get more water pulled into the roots because the water is going to follow those ions because of osmosis. So that's also going to allow more water to be pulled into the straw to then be pulled up the xylem tube. The second force is capillary action. That's essentially the idea that anytime water is in a small tube, it naturally moves upwards. This is what you see if you take like a piece of paper towel and just like touch the edges to like a wet spot on the counter or something. The water will naturally move upwards through that paper towel because there's a whole bunch of little tiny tubes built into that paper towel. The xylem tubes are very, very tiny. They are, to really see the like hole itself, you would need a microscope. And so water can climb upwards using that. And that's because of two different properties of water, adhesion and cohesion. Adhesion is this idea that water molecules are naturally attracted to the sides of a container. So as a stream of water is moving upwards, it kind of like latches onto the sides of the tube or whatever. And that allows the stream to not like collapse in on itself as it's moving upwards. And then cohesion is the fact that water molecules are attracted to one another. And so as you pull one water molecule up, it's like bonded loosely to the water molecule directly underneath it. And so they pull each other up in a chain. I don't know if you guys ever saw like Barrel of Monkeys. It was like a little game where like monkeys were like positioned like this and they would like hook onto each other's arms. That's kind of what the water molecules are like. They like latch onto each other and pull each other up. And then the last force that allows for the xylem sap to move is osmotic pressure, also called root pressure, which is this idea that because you have ions pumped into the roots and water following into the roots, you have a high water pressure buildup inside the roots in the xylem tubes. And so just because of like more water pushing in from the roots, it is going to push up the water that is in there. It can only push up small distances because eventually the force of gravity is going to outweigh the water pressure, but it can be useful in smaller plants. Cavitation is the process where you break the stream of sap that's moving upwards through a xylem tube. Essentially, this happens when you puncture a xylem tube, like from the outside of the tree, and that allows an air bubble to get into the xylem tube. As soon as that air bubble is in there, you break the chain of water molecules that were pulling each other upwards, so you no longer have that cohesion, that attaching of water molecules to each other. And as soon as that happens, transpiration can't work anymore. So once a xylem tube is cavitated, it is no longer ever going to function. Xylem tubes can only work because they exist in a vacuum. Once air gets in, you have broken that vacuum. So this would be like if you've ever like had a straw and when you like went to get the wrapper off, you like punched it against the table too hard and bent it and you like cracked the straw a little bit. And then when you go to like suck something up out of the straw, you just suck air in instead of actually sucking up your drink. That's essentially what cavitation is. The reason that this happens in trees is because of things like woodpeckers or insects that burrow into the tree, or just sometimes when the tree freezes with water inside, the water expands and can burst its own xylem tube. Or sometimes humans, like if you're like tapping for sap or something like that, you can like puncture a hole in your tree, or if you like drill into the tree to put a hammock up or something. Luckily, trees do have lots of xylem tubes, so if a couple are cavitated and don't work anymore, the rest of them can still manage and still bring enough water up to the leaves. Okay, then phloem tubes are the other type of vascular tissue, and they are made up of living cells as opposed to the xylem tubes, which are made up of dead cells. They also stack on top of one another, but they don't die as they mature. Instead, they just lose their nucleus. The cell walls between where the cells are stacked on top of each other, so what we call the end plates in the xylem tube, those don't disappear with phloem tubes, but they do develop little holes or pores, and then we call them the sieve plates. The cells do also still contain their cytoplasm, so the sap that's going to go through the phloem tube is transported through the cytoplasm. And because they don't have a nucleus anymore, they can't actually control their own functions. So instead, the phloem tubes develop what's called a companion cell, which attaches to the side of the phloem cells, and that companion cell ends up regulating everything that's happening inside the phloem tube. So these are just kind of two different diagrams of what this would look like. So we have the different cells stacked on top of each other. This is their sieve plates. So that's where the cells were touching each other. They just develop little pores. And then because while the cytoplasm is still there, the nucleus is not, you have these companion cells, which are going to regulate everything that's happening. And then this is just another diagram over here. Again, this is the phloem tube, which each of the individual cells separated by these sieve plates. They have the companion cells, which are regulating specifically when the sugar goes into the phloem tube and then when it comes out of the phloem tube. The phloem sap is made up of different sugars as well as some other nutrients, and it can go both up and down. That should say go, not slow. It can go or flow up or down. Usually you have sugar that is moved from the leaves where it's produced during photosynthesis to the roots to be stored. But then if the plant needs more energy, the phloem tubes can also move that glucose from wherever it was stored to wherever in the plant needs that energy. The phloem transport is based on something called the Munch pressure flow hypothesis. Essentially, the Munch pressure flow hypothesis says that once sugars are made in the leaves via photosynthesis, the sugars are actively pumped into the phloem tubes because they are going through the companion cells. The companion cells are regulating when this happens, and they are in charge of supplying the energy for this active transport. The water is then going to follow the sugar from the leaves into the phloem tube just because of osmosis. The water is following the dissolved solids, in this case, the dissolved sugars. And that water pressure is actually going to be what pushes the sugars down the phloem tubes. And then once the sugars get to wherever it is that they're going to be stored, whether it's tubers or roots or wherever, then once again they are actively pumped out of the phloem tube, and again that's controlled by the companion cells, and then once again the water will follow because of osmosis. When a phloem tube is punctured, it does not cavitate, so it doesn't just immediately stop working. Instead, the sap is going to continue to flow through the tube. However, usually it'll be like flowing down, and then because there's a lot of like resistance as the sap is moving through the cytoplasm, it's easier for the sap to like get pushed out of that hole and then just like down the outside of the tree where it's just going through the air instead, so there's less resistance. So usually the sap keeps flowing, but instead of flowing down the rest of the phloem tube, it flows down the outside of the tree, which is just wasting like nutrients and sugar and energy and all that stuff. And so what'll happen is the tree will form something called a resin block. A resin block is formed by the companion cells. They're the ones who control that. And if the sap is flowing downwards, then a resin block will be formed directly above wherever the hole is. If the sap is flowing upwards, the resin block will be right below wherever the hole is. Either way, essentially the resin block forms across a sieve plate and blocks off that phloem tube. So that phloem tube once the resin block forms, will no longer work. There will be something blocking the flow in that phloem tube. However, it is beneficial for the plant because the plant has other phloem tubes that it can use, and it doesn't want to be wasting all of that sugar and nutrient and energy. So this is what it would look like. So we'd have a little puncture right here. The sap would be coming down like normal, but then when it gets to that opening, it would flow out of that hole and then down the side of the tree. And so what would happen then is a resin block would form across the sieve plate, in this case above where the puncture hole is because the sap is coming downwards. And so now this phloem tube doesn't work anymore, but at least you're not losing the sap. Okay, that's it for today's lesson. We only have one more lesson of this unit.